The galaxy had been torn apart by war. Entire planets lay in ruins, their civilizations crumbled under the weight of endless battles. But now, after years of fighting, it was over. The galactic war had come to an end. Derek Hall, a human soldier, stood at the center of a great victory. He was a hero, celebrated by his fellow humans, but the weight of his victory felt heavy. The war had cost him everything: his friends, his comrades, and the life he had once known. Now, as the dust settled, Derek found himself standing in a strange new world. After the war, the victors were given the spoils, riches, land, and sometimes prisoners of war. But Derek didn't expect what was handed to him. He stood in front of a tall, silver-haired officer who handed him a small ornate box. "This is your reward, soldier," the officer said, his voice calm but stern. Derek took the box, unsure of what to expect. As he opened it, a pair of eyes met his, a deep, shimmering violet that seemed to pierce through him. Inside the box wasn't gold or a title. It was a key to something far more complicated than anything Derek had ever imagined. The key unlocked a door to a living being, an alien girl. She was stunning, her features sharp yet graceful, her skin a soft shade of purple that gleamed under the light. Her eyes, though filled with fear, were unmistakably beautiful, and Derek could see the deep sadness behind them. "This is Zara," the officer continued, "a prisoner from the defeated empire. She belongs to you now." Derek's mind raced. He had fought in the war, but never once had he imagined this. He was used to the chaos of the battlefield, the sounds of weapons, and war cries. But this was something entirely different. A slave, a beautiful alien girl, bound by the customs of her empire, was now his responsibility. But the word slave didn't sit well with him. He had never been one to believe in owning others. Zara stood silently before him, her posture stiff, her eyes still locked on the floor. She didn't speak, but the tension in her body was clear. Derek could feel her resentment, her anger at being reduced to nothing more than a prize for a war that wasn't hers. He didn't know what to say or do. Was she a prize, a victory to be celebrated? Or was she a person, someone who deserved respect and freedom? The officer's words echoed in his mind, but they meant little now. Derek's hand hovered over the key, unsure if he should speak or just leave. Zara didn't deserve this life. Derek couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort as he walked back to his quarters with Zara by his side. His mind raced with questions. How was he supposed to treat her? She was a prisoner of war, but not just any prisoner, a slave. He had seen slaves in other parts of the galaxy, but never up close. Never like this. Zara walked beside him, her steps measured and quiet. Her eyes remained on the ground, as though avoiding any form of connection. Derek could feel the tension in the air. She was angry, and he couldn't blame her. She had been brought here against her will, stripped of everything she had known, and handed over like a mere possession. But what was Derek supposed to do? What could he do? When they reached his quarters, Derek motioned for Zara to enter first. She hesitated but eventually walked past him, keeping her head low. He didn't know how to make her feel comfortable. How could he? She was from a different world, a different species. They spoke different languages, had different customs, and yet here they were, forced together by the aftermath of a war neither of them had chosen. Derek's quarters were simple: bare walls, a small table, and a bed tucked in the corner. It was nothing like the lavish accommodations the higher-ranking officers received, but it was enough for him. He sat down at the table, trying to figure out what to say. Zara stood by the door, her eyes scanning the room but not meeting his gaze. "This is your home now," Derek said, his voice softer than he had intended. "I don't know what to do with you, but I won't treat you like property." Zara's head snapped up, her violet eyes filled with a fire Derek hadn't expected. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice sharp. "I am not a thing to be kept. I am a warrior. I was born to fight, to serve my people. I am not meant to be locked away like a pet." Derek was taken aback. Her words stung, but they also made him think. She wasn't just some helpless woman in need of protection. She had been a warrior, someone with pride, someone with strength. And now, because of the war, she had been reduced to this, a slave. Zara turned away, pacing the small room. "I do not want your pity," she said coldly, her back still to him. "I would rather die than live like this." Derek felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He hadn't asked for this situation, and neither had Zara. But the reality was that she was here, and he couldn't change that. He had no idea how to fix things, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her feel this way. He couldn't let her feel like an object. "Then let me help you," he said quietly. "I may not know how, but I won't abandon you." Zora was silent for a long moment. Derek could see her struggle, the internal conflict playing out behind her eyes. Finally, she looked at him, her expression softer, though the bitterness remained. "We'll see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were tense, as Derek tried to figure out how to navigate his new life with Zora. She remained distant, her gaze often cold and full of defiance. She didn't speak much, but her actions spoke louder than words. Every time Derek tried to talk to her, she would either ignore him or respond with sharp, bitter remarks. She was a slave, yes, but she wasn't helpless. Derek could see the fire in her, the strength that still lingered beneath the surface. Derek did his best to respect her space, not pushing her too hard. He knew she was hurting. Grief from the war, from the fall of her people, and from the loss of her freedom. But every time he caught a glimpse of her fierce spirit, Derek couldn't help but admire her. Zara was no ordinary prisoner. She had fought for her empire, had likely faced unimaginable battles, and now she was here, in a place where she had no control. Zara spent most of her time in the corner of the room, staring out of the small window, her back always turned to Derek. He wondered if she was thinking about the home she had lost, the empire that no longer existed. Sometimes he saw her clenching her fists, as though fighting the urge to destroy everything in sight. One morning, Derek decided to try something different. He had read about alien cultures in his training, but none of the manuals gave him a clear answer on how to deal with a prisoner turned slave. Zara wasn't just anyone. She was an alien, yes, but also a person. Derek had to remind himself of that every time he felt frustration rise. He wasn't sure how to break through her wall, but he had to try. "Zara," he called out as she paced the room again. She stopped, but didn't turn to face him. Derek took a deep breath. "I know you're angry. I would be too. But if you want to talk, I'll listen." Zora didn't answer. For a long time, there was silence between them, thick and heavy. Derek had begun to think she wouldn't respond when, finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but Derek could hear the pain in it. "You don't understand," Zara said, her words full of bitterness. "I was a warrior. I fought to protect my people, my planet. And now I am nothing. A slave, to be passed around like an object." Derek's heart sank. He had expected anger, but not this kind of sadness. Zara's voice cracked slightly, and for a brief moment, Derek could see the vulnerability she had been hiding. She wasn't just angry at the war. She wasn't just angry at the humans who defeated her empire. She was angry at herself. "You still have power," Derek said gently, his words careful. "You still have your strength. I see it in you. You don't have to be what others want you to be." Zara finally turned to look at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know what I've lost." Derek stood up slowly, meeting her gaze. "I know you've lost a lot, but you haven't lost yourself. I'll help you, whatever it takes." There was a long pause, and then Zara, surprisingly, looked away. She didn't answer, but something in her eyes softened just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The quiet days began to wear on Derek. He had hoped that over time, Zara would grow more comfortable in her new life, that she would begin to trust him. But as each day passed, the divide between them only seemed to grow. Zara's resistance was not just physical, it was in every look, every gesture. She refused to acknowledge any kindness from him. If Derek offered her food, she would ignore it or push it away. If he tried to talk, she would turn her back and walk away. Zara's silence was her form of rebellion. It was as if she had built a wall between them that Derek could not break. He couldn't understand why she didn't trust him. He had never given her a reason to fear him. Yet every time he reached out, she pulled further away. One evening, as Derek sat reading in his room, he heard the sounds of movement from the corner where Zara usually stood, as she always did, lost in her thoughts. This time, however, the noise was different. It wasn't the usual quiet shuffle. It sounded like something was being moved, something heavy. Derek stood up, his heart racing. He turned toward the corner of the room just in time to see Zara grab a small metal rod from the floor. Her face was set in determination, her eyes dark with anger. She didn't even flinch when Derek stepped forward. "What are you doing?" Derek asked, his voice firm. Zara's eyes locked with his, full of fire. She raised the rod as if preparing to strike. "You may have saved me from the battlefield," she spat, her voice sharp, "but you can't keep me in chains. I'm not your prisoner. Not anymore." Derek froze for a moment, taken aback by her fierce determination. He had expected anger, yes, but not this raw emotion. This level of rebellion. Zara wasn't just rebelling against him. She was rebelling against everything she had lost. Her home, her people, and her freedom. But Derek wasn't about to let things escalate into violence. He stepped forward slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Zara, put it down," he said calmly. "You're not a prisoner here. You don't need to fight me. I'm trying to help you." Zara scoffed, her grip tightening on the rod. "Help me? You think you can just fix this? You don't understand anything, human. You can't undo what's been done." Derek's heart sank as he saw the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't just angry, she was lost. She had no idea what to do with herself now that everything she knew had been destroyed. Derek could see the pain hidden beneath her anger, and for the first time, he understood how much she had been broken by the war. He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "I can't undo the past, but I can promise you one thing. I'm not going to force you to be something you're not. You don't have to fight me. You don't have to be alone." For a long moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick. Zara's breathing was heavy, her grip still tight on the rod. Then, slowly, her shoulders slumped. The defiance left her eyes, replaced by exhaustion. She dropped the rod to the floor, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. Derek didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't give up on her. The next few days felt quieter, but Derek could sense that things were shifting between him and Zara. The tension had not entirely disappeared, but it was softer, more manageable. Zara had stopped fighting him with such fury, though her silence still lingered. She spent more time in the room now, sitting by the window or reading old records Derek had found about her people. One evening, as they were going through some old documents, Derek noticed something strange in a map Zara had drawn. It wasn't one of the maps he had expected to find in the archives. This one was different. It showed hidden paths across the galaxy, marked with strange symbols that Derek couldn't decipher. "Zara," Derek called, pulling her attention away from a page she was reading. "What is this?" Zara glanced at the map and then quickly tried to close the book, but Derek was too quick. He stepped closer and looked at the symbols more carefully. "They were used by my people," Zara said quietly, her voice tense. "It's an old path, one we used to travel in secret." Derek's curiosity grew. "What's hidden along these paths?" Zara hesitated, biting her lip, then sighed. "A weapon. Something my people built, something powerful. It was meant to keep our enemies at bay, but it was lost when my empire fell. If anyone finds it, they could use it to restore the empire's power." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Derek had learned that wars weren't always fought with guns and ships. Sometimes, the true weapons were things forgotten in the past, things that could reshape the future. "So, you're saying someone might be looking for it?" Derek asked, his voice low. Zora nodded. "There are still some loyalists to the old empire. They would stop at nothing to find it. They'll do whatever it takes to get their hands on the weapon. It could be dangerous, Derek. It could change everything." Derek thought for a moment. The galaxy was already fragile after the war. What would happen if an army of fanatical loyalists found a weapon capable of shifting the balance of power? It could start a new war, one even worse than the last. "We need to find it first," Derek said, his tone firm. "If it's as dangerous as you say, we can't let it fall into the wrong hands." Zora looked at him, a strange mixture of hope and hesitation in her eyes. "And how do you propose we do that? It's hidden on a planet no one can reach. Even I don't know exactly where it is." Derek thought for a moment. There were still so many unknowns, but one thing was clear. They had to act before someone else did. They couldn't let the mistakes of the past repeat themselves. "We'll figure it out together," Derek said, determination filling his voice. "I'll help you find it. We'll keep it safe." Zora didn't respond immediately, but for the first time, she seemed to consider his words. The war might have taken everything from her, but now, it seemed like there was something worth fighting for again. The journey ahead was not going to be easy. Derek and Zora knew that searching for the hidden weapon would be dangerous, but they couldn't waste any more time. If the wrong people found it first, the consequences would be disastrous. Their first step was to gather information, and that meant contacting someone who might know more about the hidden paths on the galaxy map Zora had found. Derek wasn't sure who to trust. Most of the old leaders were either dead or in hiding. But there was one person who could be useful, a smuggler named Vince, who had survived the war by keeping to the shadows, dealing in secrets and supplies. Vince's ship was a rusted old thing, docked on a forgotten station near the outskirts of a war-torn planet. It wasn't much to look at, but Derek knew that it was exactly the kind of place they needed to visit. When they landed, Zora tensed beside him, her eyes darting around warily. "This is not a safe place," she whispered. "I don't trust anyone here." Derek nodded, understanding her caution. He didn't trust anyone either, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Together, they walked through the dimly lit corridors of the station, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Vince wasn't hard to find. His reputation preceded him, and his office was exactly where Derek expected it, hidden behind a pile of crates in the darkest corner of the station. When they entered, the smuggler was sitting at a desk, his back to them. He didn't turn around when they walked in, but his voice was sharp and welcoming. "I've been expecting you," he said, still facing away. "You don't come all the way out here without a reason." Derek and Zora exchanged a glance, both of them on edge. Vince was a man of few words, but those words were always dangerous. Derek didn't waste time. "We need information on the hidden paths," Derek said. "And the weapon. Do you know anything about it?" Vince finally turned around, a grin spreading across his face. "Ah, the weapon. I've heard whispers about that. Not many know where it's hidden, but I know someone who might." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "But information isn't free. You'll have to pay for it." Derek's hand instinctively went to his pocket, but Zara stopped him with a look. She wasn't about to let a smuggler take advantage of them. "We don't have time for games," she said, her voice cold. "Tell us what you know, or we'll find another way." Vince raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her fierceness. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I know a group who's been searching for that weapon. They're fanatics, loyalists to the old empire. If you want to get ahead of them, You'll need to get to the planet Verosa first. It's a dangerous place, but it's where the weapon is believed to be. Derek's mind raced. Verosa was a desolate, hostile planet. Getting there wouldn't be easy. But if it was the key to finding the weapon, it was their best chance. "Thank you," Derek said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We'll take it from here." Vince chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Just remember, there's always a price to pay. Nothing's free in this galaxy." As they left the station, Derek glanced at Zora. She was silent, her expression unreadable. They had a new destination now, but their journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Derek and Zora's journey to Verosa was more grueling than they had imagined. The planet's surface was a barren wasteland, with dust storms that could strip the flesh from bone. The only way to navigate was by using old maps and coordinates that Derek and Zora had scrounged together, but even that didn't feel like enough. The weapon's location was still a mystery, buried somewhere beneath the planet's surface, hidden for centuries. As they made their way through the desolate landscape, they encountered no signs of life, only the haunting echoes of a world long forgotten. Derek knew they were close. His instincts told him they had arrived at the right place. But there was still something unsettling in the air, a feeling of being watched. Zora felt it too, though she said nothing. That's when they saw the first sign that something was wrong. A ship, dark and sleek, appeared on the horizon, too close to be a coincidence. Derek's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the ship of a scavenger or a lost traveler. It was military grade, fast and efficient, a ship designed for one purpose, taking what others had. Zora's hand went to the side of her coat, where she hid a small weapon she had taken from the wreckage of a fallen ship. "Derek, they're coming for the same thing we are." Derek didn't need to ask who they were. He knew, just as Zora did. It was the loyalists to her fallen empire, the very people who would stop at nothing to restore their lost glory. "They must have followed us," Derek muttered, gripping the hilt of his own weapon. "We're not the only ones looking for the weapon." Zora's eyes flashed with determination. "We need to get there first. They can't have it." Derek nodded, but the moment he started to move toward the site where they believed the weapon was hidden, something unexpected happened. A voice crackled over his communicator, a voice he recognized immediately. "Derek, it's me," the voice said. "I'm sorry, but you've been betrayed." Derek froze. The voice belonged to Vince, the smuggler they had trusted just days before. The shock hit Derek like a physical blow. "You were never meant to find the weapon," Vince continued, his tone cold. "You were a useful tool, but the weapon belongs to those who will use it for the right cause, not you." Before Derek could respond, the line went dead. The betrayal hung in the air like smoke, and Derek's mind raced. Vince had known from the start that Derek and Zora were being used. They weren't the only ones who wanted the weapon. They had been led here, purposefully, so the loyalists could find it first. Zora clenched her fists. "We were set up, Derek." Derek didn't need to hear more. He already knew, but it wasn't just about the weapon anymore. They had come this far, and they weren't going to let anyone take it without a fight. "Then we'll make sure no one gets it," Derek said, his voice resolute. "We find it first, no matter what." As the enemy ship drew closer, Derek and Zora stood together, their backs against the wind and their hearts burning with the same determination. The game had changed, and now it was a race against time. No one would take this victory from them, not without a fight. The moment Derek and Zora saw the enemy ship closing in, the world around them seemed to slow. They had been betrayed, yes, but they were still determined. The weapon, the powerful relic that could change the fate of the galaxy, lay just ahead. They couldn't let it fall into the hands of the loyalists. Derek looked at Zora, who was already preparing herself. Her eyes were cold and determined. She was no longer the broken, angry alien who had entered his life a few weeks ago. Zora had found something in herself, something worth fighting for. She was ready, and so was he. "We get to it first," Derek said, his voice low, but full of fire. "We don't let them win." Zara nodded, gripping her weapon tighter. They had no choice but to face whatever was coming. It was clear now that the stakes were higher than just a weapon. The future of the galaxy, of Zara's people, rested on their shoulders. They made their way toward the entrance to the underground cavern where the weapon was supposed to be hidden. The wind howled as the storm intensified, and Derek could barely make out the faint outline of the entrance in the distance. Time was running out. They had to be fast. Suddenly, the sound of boots crunching against the dust echoed behind them. The Loyalists had arrived. Derek turned quickly, his heart racing. He saw a group of armed figures approaching, moving with purpose. The leader, a tall alien with cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. "You're too late," the leader called, his voice carrying over the wind. "The weapon belongs to the Empire. It's not for you, human." Derek's pulse quickened. He didn't know how many they were, but he could tell from their confident strides that they were well trained. He and Zara were outnumbered, but Derek wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "This ends now," Derek said, stepping forward, pulling his weapon from his side. Zara stood beside him, ready to fight. The Loyalists hesitated for a moment, perhaps unsure of how to deal with a human who wasn't afraid. But then, as if on cue, they raised their weapons. The first shot rang out, a bright flash in the darkening storm. Derek and Zara ducked for cover, narrowly avoiding the blast. The battle had begun. Derek fought with everything he had. His training had prepared him for many things, but nothing like this. The Loyalists fought fiercely, but Derek and Zara were determined. Together, they moved in sync, dodging attacks and returning fire. Each moment felt like a lifetime, but there was no turning back now. In the chaos of the fight, Derek saw the leader of the Loyalists pushing forward, heading straight for the cavern entrance. Derek knew that if they let him reach the weapon first, it would be over. Without thinking, Derek lunged forward, knocking the Loyalist leader off course. The two of them tumbled to the ground, struggling for control of the weapon. But Derek wasn't going to let this slip away. He fought hard, every punch and kick driven by the desire to protect the future. Zara, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle against the others. With fierce grace, she took down two Loyalists, her movements quick and precise. It was clear this was her fight, just as much as it was Derek's. Finally, with one final push, Derek threw the leader off of him and ran toward the entrance. Zara joined him, and together they entered the cavern. The weapon was within their reach. The galaxy's future was in their hands now. They had to make sure they were the ones who controlled it. The cavern was colder than Derek had expected, the air thick with dust, and the faint scent of something ancient. They had made it. After the intense battle outside, they had finally reached the heart of the cave, where the weapon lay hidden. It was both thrilling and terrifying. The weapon could change the galaxy, and in the wrong hands, it could destroy it. Derek and Zara moved cautiously, each step echoing in the quiet expanse of the cavern. The walls were lined with strange symbols, ancient markings that Derek couldn't understand. They had come so far, but something still felt off. The silence was too heavy, as if the cavern was holding its breath. At the center of the cavern was a large pedestal, and on it, a glowing crystal. The weapon. Its surface shimmered, pulsing with energy, but it was unlike anything Derek had ever seen. It wasn't a gun or a blade. It was a force, something that could bend reality itself, and it was more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever known. Zara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the crystal. Her expression was a mix of awe and fear. She had spoken of this weapon, but seeing it now made everything real. It was more than a weapon. It was the key to everything her people had lost. "This is it," Zara whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Derek stood beside her, but he knew the danger was far from over. They hadn't come this far just to be handed victory. The Loyalists were still out there, and they wouldn't let this weapon go without a fight. We have to make sure no one else gets it, Derek said, his voice steady. Not the Loyalists, not anyone. Zara nodded, but her expression was conflicted. I know. But the weapon, it could rebuild everything. It could bring back my people. Derek looked at her, understanding the weight of her words. She had lost so much. The weapon could restore her empire, bring her people back from the brink of extinction. But at what cost? Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. The leader of the Loyalists, the one who had betrayed them, stepped into the cavern, his eyes cold and calculating. He was flanked by several other Loyalists, all of them armed and ready for a fight. You really thought you could keep it for yourself? The leader sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. This belongs to the Empire. It was always meant to be ours. Derek stood his ground, his hand on his own weapon. Not anymore, he said firmly. You've lost. This ends now. The leader laughed, a bitter sound. You're a fool. The galaxy will never be the same. The Empire will rise again, and this weapon will be our tool. Derek and Zara exchanged a glance. There was no time for more words. The Loyalists had already made their move, and Derek wasn't about to let them take the weapon. The battle that followed was fierce. The Loyalists attacked with everything they had. But Derek and Zara fought with everything in them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing the future. With every strike, Derek pushed forward, determined to protect Zara and the weapon. Zara fought alongside him, her strength and skill on full display as she took down Loyalist after Loyalist. Together, they were unstoppable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the Loyalists fell. The cavern was silent again, but this time it was different. They had won. The weapon was safe. Derek looked at Zara, his breath heavy from the fight. It's over. The future's ours now. Zara's eyes met his, filled with something new, hope. The galaxy was still broken, but now they had a chance to rebuild. Together, they would shape a future no one had dared to imagine. The dust settled in the cavern, the echoes of the battle fading into the stillness. Derek and Zara stood side by side, the weapon now safely in their hands. The Loyalists were gone, their ambitions crushed, and the power of the weapon was no longer a threat to the galaxy. For the first time in a long while, Derek felt a sense of peace, a feeling that had eluded him since the start of the war. Zara turned toward him, her expression softer than it had been in days. The weight of the battle was still visible in her eyes, but there was something else there now. Hope. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough. They had come through this together. We did it, Zara said quietly, her voice filled with disbelief. She had never imagined she would stand here, holding the weapon that could restore her people, and yet it was in her hands. Derek looked at her, understanding that this was more than just a victory for him. It was a chance for Zara to rebuild. The weapon could change everything, but only if they used it wisely. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he was certain of one thing. They would face it together. Zara placed the weapon on a nearby stone pedestal, her fingers lingering over its smooth surface. The crystal pulsed gently, as if alive, as if it recognized the weight of the decision that lay ahead. She stood there for a long moment, lost in thought. I never thought I would have a second chance, Zara said, her voice low. After everything that happened to my people, to me, I thought it was over. But now, I see that there's still hope. Derek stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. The galaxy's broken, but we don't have to stay broken. We can rebuild it, one step at a time. Zara turned to him, her eyes searching his face, as if seeing him for the first time. The distance that had once separated them, the anger and mistrust, had faded. They were no longer enemies. They were partners. They had fought for this moment together, and now they would fight for the future. Zara gave a small, grateful smile. I never thought I would find someone like you. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. Derek shook his head. I didn't do anything. We did this together. And now, it's up to us to decide what happens next. They both turned their attention back to the weapon. It was still glowing softly, its power undeniable. But it was more than just a tool for destruction. It was a symbol of hope. The galaxy could be rebuilt, not through war and power, but through unity and understanding. It was a new beginning. Derek knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, enemies who would try to stop them, and many who would question their decisions. But for the first time, Derek wasn't afraid of what the future held. He had Zara by his side, and together, they would forge a new path. The galaxy was waiting, and Derek was ready to face it, with Zara, the woman who had once been his enemy, now his ally, and perhaps, in time, something more.